Everyone. I'm Janet McHenry, and this is Writing Wise for Book Marketing Pro Academy. And today we are going to learn about various ways to outline your memoir. So let's first talk about what a memoir is not, and then we'll define it, and then we'll look at various ways to approach memoir writing. What a memoir is not journal writing. So you simply don't grab your journal and then just type it up. Similarly, your diary, if you're one of those people who writes all the things that you've been doing throughout the week, it's kind of just a chronology of events. That's also not a memoir. And it's typically also not your entire life's story. So it doesn't start with "I was born in." It is, and it's also not a rant. It's not a story about you as a victim of a series of events or a certain person or group of people. It is a redemption story. So, a memoir is a collection of memories, and you'll see that you're going to be, and I'm going to give you a strategy for this, various kinds of snapshots of your life, but just those moments that matter for the central issue of how you were transformed, how God changed your life. It's a character sketch of you. And so it's not so much just a series of events thrown together, but we see the internal change. We see a transformational process that you go through throughout the external events that are coming from all sides. It's your perception also of your experience. And people say, well, is everything true? Does everything have to be exactly true? I will just counsel you this way. It is your best memory of the things that have happened in your life. What we want to do with our memoir writing is to help others with similar kinds of struggles. So, if someone has been through trauma, then that's the external kind of problem that's the external kind of problem that's going to manifest some kind of internal heart issue that's going on. And it's going to be able to help. Your book will be able to help others with similar kinds of trauma kind of issues. But it also needs to entertain the reader. It needs to be really good narrative writing. So I often counsel people that if you want to write a memoir, to take every fiction course that you can afford or that you can find, read books on writing fiction, because you're going to use those same kind of scene creating strategies to write your memoir. It's also to educate others about an issue. So perhaps if someone hadn't been through trauma, but they know someone who's going through that, it helps them understand some of the underlying kinds of issues there. And it also helps you as the writer to kind of define who you are, to create meaning out of your life. And that's more of a personal kind of objective. There are different ways to approach memoir writing. Some might be more autobiographical in nature, such as this book, Educated by Tara Westover. And it's a story about how her family kept her isolated from the world, her and her siblings isolated from the world, to the point where she was not allowed to go to school, not allowed to do anything in the public. And it does start with that child and then moves to that point when she's well into her young womanhood. So it is more of kind of an autobiographical approach. And technically, English teacher me would probably say, I think really this is an autobiography, but we don't see that kind of tagline on a book anymore, an autobiography. We just see the term memoir. So we'll let it go. There's the idea of a traditional memoir, and that is, a traditional memoir will weave in more kind of poetic sorts of devices. Perhaps you'll see a metaphorical thread throughout the story. I found that in this particular memoir by Carlos Airy, Waiting for Snow in Havana. It's about growing up as a young boy pre Castro in Cuba. And then when the takeover occurs, what happens to his family, to him, and society in general. But it had kind of, there were lots of poetic sorts of devices, whereas the earlier one that I showed you was pretty much kind of straight, just straight writing. There is a type also that is really more literary in nature, and an example that I'll typically pull is this one, Under a Desert Sky by Lynn Hartke, and she weaves a metaphor throughout, and the metaphor has to do with journeying and her holy hiking, and she ties that into her own personal journey through cancer. And then there's another called the prescriptive memoir. I don't think I have one here, but a good example of the prescriptive approach would be a book called Life in Spite of Me by Kristen Anderson, co-written with Tricia Goyer. And the prescriptive nature of this type of memoir will have a shift in the chapter where the story ends, and then there's more like a Christian living book kind of helpful piece at the end of each of the chapters that provide application points, some perhaps some biblical kind of teaching and that kind of thing. So it's a combo of the memoir and the Christian living book. And the way that Tricia Goyer did this for Kristen Anderson, who in this Life in Spite of Me memoir, was that they had a letter at the end of each chapter that was called A Letter to My Younger Self. And that way she could step out of the story and talk about like her misconceptions, her errors, the choices that she made and what she would have done differently, which provided the prescriptive kind of approach. Let's talk next about chronological. And this is the first of the ways that you could begin to approach a memoir, and then in terms of outlining it. So chronology is time, and so you're starting at the beginning of an experience and then moving toward that point where you have an aha moment, etc. And then then there are just falling scenes that kind of verify that the change actually has occurred. So there's a beginning to end kind of structure there: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, then the resolution to the issue. And this will work for testimony kinds of memoirs, redemptive arcs, which I really feel like there needs to be a redemptive arc in every single memoir. We want to see that personal transformation occur. We don't want to see this person still in a place of victimhood. This will also work for conversion stories, but make sure that you have a clear understanding of this before and after arc of you as a character. You are the central character of your story. And just as in a novel, we like to see a character grow, we want to see that in the memoir that you're writing as well. So here's something more specific that could help you develop this chronological kind of approach. Early foundations. Okay, what kind of family did you have? Who was your family? What kind of faith exposure do you have? What's the initial memory of the wound or the struggle that you had within your family or from some other exterior influence? And then what is the inciting incident? What is that going to be, that dramatic moment when you get the phone call, your father has, been killed in Afghanistan, or you receive a diagnosis of cancer, or, you discover something significant, your spouse has been unfaithful. That's what we call an inciting incident. And that begins that it will tend to, that doesn't necessarily begin the internal issue that's going on, but it will manifest that struggle. So there's a sense of shock, perhaps, and this could be a way that you could approach the chapter writing, a sense of shock and silence. You don't know what to do, emotional fallout. You feel isolated, confused, if everything feels dark. And then there's the development of the actual crisis, this wound, this struggle over several chapters. There are going to be chapters where you're wrestling with God, the why questions, the doubts, your anger, God's silence, apparent silence towards you. And then as a result of that, maybe you continue the internal conflict because you're making bad decisions in response to that. And then at some point, there is a sense of spiritual awakening and that moment of personal internal climax where you're making that choice to trust God in this particular situation. You're giving up the whatever it is that you've been struggling with, whether that's a misidentified sense of identity, perhaps that's also jealousy. It's some kind of issue like that, a major kind of character fault. And so you have this spiritual awakening, you choose to trust God, and then you have the strength again to face the toughest external problems in your story. And this is going to be true for any kind of narrative, whether you're writing a novel or whether you're going to be writing nonfiction. So you have those climatic scenes then. You're victorious over them. That doesn't mean that cancer necessarily went away. Okay. But you yourself are in that better place of trusting God for the situation. And then that's not the end of the story, because what we need to see from you are a couple chapters after that to know that your transformation has actually been authentic. So we need to see you maybe a month down the road, maybe a couple years down the road, in a couple chapters at the end of the book, to see how God has rebuilt your life. The traditional kind of approach to memoir writing, again, you're starting with crisis. And I was schooled, and I've written several pieces of fiction, several fictional books. And so, and I was schooled that you start with conflict, start with a bang. That first paragraph, inciting incident right there. What's the problem? And then that begins to manifest. It creates that internal, the manifesting of that internal struggle because of the external things that are happening to you. So is there one major event that happened? Maybe it's the phone call. I don't want to be married to you anymore. That kind of thing. I never loved you. Some kind of major loss in your life. An illness that has changed the trajectory of your life, for, years. Some sort of public failure of some kind within your family or someone you trusted, a betrayal of some kind. Maybe the church, turned you guys away for one reason or another. Maybe there's a sense of faith deconstruction that, you don't believe anymore. What is that? And then that will build from chapter to chapter as you have these continued pieces of struggle until you get to that internal turning point time when you want to make that turning point visual in nature as much as possible. It's really hard for readers to understand something that sounds like this. All of a sudden, I realized that. Well, how did that happen? Where were you? Create those scenes. What were the struggles? What exactly, what did you see? Even if it weren't necessarily literally visual, what did you see in your mind, or what were those actual turning of the cogs? What was the process there? And if you can make that visual for the reader, then they can see it as well, and then they can apply that to their lives and be encouraged. One example of that that I learned from Guideposts workshop years ago when I used to write for Guideposts, and I write devotions now for them, but I used to write stories for them. So picture this guy. He's been struggling with God. He's mad at God. God's never, helped him with this situation, that situation. So he's going to run away. So he gets in a boat and he takes his dog and they head out into the ocean. All of a sudden, the engine dies. They got nothing. The wind, a storm is coming in. He doesn't know what to do. And so, at that point, he knows he needs to trust God, but he's not sure exact. God hasn't shown up for him at all. So he doesn't know what to do. So he's looking at his dog, and the dog is like happy. And dog is looking at him, isn't this fun? The dog is like, I love you. And so he has this in sense of like, oh, so that's what it is. Despite the external situation, I simply, in that same way, need to tell God, I love you. I trust you. I know you're with me in this moment. We're going to get through this. So see how that was a visual kind of a turnaround there. It's kind of corny, but it's probably been used in some form or another, hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of times over and over again. Notice also that publishers will want to look for emotional honesty there. Again, if you want to play the victim all the way throughout your memoir, people will get tired of that. People want to see, how do we actually get through these difficult situations in our lives? We have to be honest that maybe there's some part of me that's not been trusting God, that's not been willing, that's not been vulnerable, and that's been not willing to change. So we want to see that spiritual wrestling, and you can do that through this seeing creation as things seem to be getting darker, and then you're struggling, and then you fail again, that kind of thing. But at some point in the story, through those climatic chapters, we want to be able to offer hope to the reader without those cliched, all of a sudden I realize that kind of moments, because that's just not going to do it for the reader. So how would we put this together then? Again, this is just a basic outline. I'm not saying 9 chapters because those would be way too long chapters, because we're looking at a work that's probably going to be in the nature of 75,000 words. So you can't have 9 chapters. That's way too much for someone to read at night. Probably at least twice that many. But these give you a sense, just an essence of how to hang this various scenes that you have. So think about the world that shaped you. What was the mindset? What was your thinking? How was that created? What's your external circumstance, etc.? Think also then, you're developing those internal kind of wounds or fears or insecurities or false beliefs that you've had about the faith or about human nature itself or about who you are. Inciting incident, the day everything broke, the day everything kind of fell apart. And then, and then there's fallout. Maybe everything fell apart, and then where are the friends? Where's the family? They all disappear. They're not helping in the way that you would hope. So that could be the what I didn't see coming kinds of scenes that could happen there. Then you're going to have a series of wrestlings. Maybe you try something and it fails. You try something and you fail. And you're wrestling through these different wounds, these fears, these misunderstandings with God. And you're also having, an intermingling of wrestling with community, with scripture, with those Bible verses that people are telling you and they're not hitting right? They're just not hitting right. Or maybe false beliefs that you've had. Maybe you've hung your faith on something that really wasn't substantive enough, And so it's a point of chapters of discovery, self-discovery, discovery about God, discovery about human nature. And then to that point with internal transformation first before the external climatic difficult scenes, so that you are strong enough to be able to handle that. So what is that surrender point? What is that new understanding? And maybe that's built over a couple different chapters there as well. And then, facing the tough moments, and then rebuilding your life. And then again, don't just leave us hanging there and I knew I knew everything was going to be fine after that. Really? I'm not convinced. Take me 30 days down the road. Take me 2 years down the road. And it doesn't have to be happily ever after and everything fell into place. It's just that you internally have changed, and we can see that through the creation of your scenes. In all of these pieces, no, there's a separate note here. Note that you can bring in flashbacks, so it doesn't necessarily have to be all the whole story itself be chronological in nature the way it actually happened, because maybe as some difficult situation or conversation comes up, then you can have a flashback scene within a chapter that goes back to, oh, when I was 10, I remember dad telling me. Or, when I was 15 and on that first date I ever had with another boy. Okay, so you can bring those in to create that clarification and to kind of bring understanding to the reader about how you were actually formed, how your thinking was formed, how your behavior was formed. I like this idea also. The way Another way to outline memoir is the concept of journey, and lots of really classic sort of novelists have done that. The one that immediately comes to mind to me for me is Huck Finn, because Huck and Jim they're going down the Mississippi. They're trying to find the way to the Ohio River so they can go to freedom. So it follows the story of Huck Finn, and the transformation of him occurs during this journey down the Mississippi River. Okay, we're not going to do that. We're probably not going to have a boating down the river experience, but it could be geographic moves. When my childhood years were in upstate New York, and when I was in seventh grade, I was in New York, eighth grade in Phoenix, ninth grade in Albuquerque, 10th grade in the Sacramento area. So that, I could write a memoir about, maybe I take the reader from one place to the other in those points of self-discovery or whatever. It could be a sense of ministry calling and how that has shifted or grown or developed for you. Various kinds of life shifts. Maybe your first husband died, and so then this happened, and then this God brought this person into your life, and then he passed away. This is Robin Dykstra's story, by the way. She had two husbands who died. So all of these life shifts and moving, and then move the character. It's really important in narrative that we're not just the character is not just sitting in a chair and just thinking and have conversations on the phone. There has to be physical movement. So that's the brilliance of the journey story. I know that Cynthia Rookti, it is a novel, but she wrote a story about a couple who decides to just go on the road in their little camper trailer. I mean, their marriage is a wreck, but they have to deliver this trailer. And so it's this journey from one campsite to another, where they begin to see life in each other in different ways. There are different ways that you could pull this off. This could work for a marriage restoration, for a recovery journey, for a pilgrimage of, spiritual understanding of some kind of a parenting journey, and what might, take place, different kind of parenting seasons that you have. We joke that we have two Gen X kids and we have two millennials, and they're so different from one another. So that could be approached, like if I were going to write a parenting kind of memoir, that could be an approach there, the different seasons of parenting in that way. To think about this path that God has led you on, and what have been some of those moments of understanding where you really felt like things clicked for you in some kind of a way. Keep track of that. Put that into a document where you're thinking about your own personal journey. And then perhaps also in your memoir, if you want to kind of strive to make it more literary, this could pair with scenes of a biblical journey as well, such as the Exodus, or wilderness experience, or Nehemiah's rebuilding, of the walls in Jerusalem. So if you want to bring in sort of kind of biblical kinds of strength to your story, you could interweave those kinds of scenes and fictionalize some of the biblical narrative. Okay. So here you go. For a more specific outline, think of the specific call in your life or whatever that is. For me, the initial call in my life was God wanted me to go into campus ministry. I knew it as a college senior. I had the application ready to go in the mail, and then all these fears came over me. What if I can't raise support? What if they send me to Africa? All the what ifs came into play. And so, that application went into the round file and I didn't follow through that. Struggle for the next 13 years of my life over the concept of God's lordship. He wanted me to submit my life to his lordship. And so then I got a new call on my life. So think about those series of resistance points and your struggles. You can't have a story and all of a sudden, 2 chapters, 3 chapters later, oh, I get it all and everything fell into place. And then it's all these, 20 chapters of happily ever after stuff. That's not going to resonate with the reader because she's still struggling. She picked up your book to learn how. And so you got to take them through all those resistance points, the struggles, the times where you continue to say no, you didn't believe, you didn't trust, whatever that is. And then finally, there is a decision to obey. And then maybe that decision, and there are lots of testing points to kind of that prove, and then maybe you do fail, and then you fail again in some kind of way. And that doesn't mean that success has not occurred. The worldly success has not occurred. It's just that, you weren't all in. You weren't all in with God, and talk about that. Be really open. So then take that reader to the point of breakthrough and that final surrender. Here I give myself to your lordship, God. And again, then what might that new calling be? And then show us the you in that new calling place. Um, Another really great approach could be kind of a dual timeline. This is being done in fiction a lot. I think it could work really well with narrative. I have recently seen this in a memoir by a woman named Anina Swan. That is her pseudonym, but you could find that on Amazon. And she has 3 threads in her memoir. So she has her current situation as an adult. And then she's weaving that with scenes from childhood, but she's also including letters from the abuser in her life that she actually received. Okay, that she actually received. Okay, so, and I don't want to give more away than that, but it's really an interesting approach there. So you could alternate either chapters or just scenes within the same chapter. Current adult, you're a mess. A childhood, and that can help to lend understandings, to alternate those throughout. So you're alternating the past story, present struggles, only including again those scenes that would matter, that the scenes that make sense in terms of how you've gained new understanding. So you're building on the character development of yourself, um, and the bringing in maybe, the 2 different perspectives, childhood, adulthood, or adolescence, adulthood. It bring about some real deep reflection, so that your memoir is a little more layered, a little more interesting. Um, so you could follow a chronological sequence that kind of zigzags from childhood to adulthood, back to childhood again. The literary memoir can look so many different kinds of ways. It might simply have a metaphorical thread, that kind of a journey thread, or a water thread, or a garden thread, a growth thread. It could have mountains and mountain hiking, thread throughout. So it's more than just your story. And I think that's really true for all of these different approaches to memoir telling, that to keep that in mind. that because you're drawing meaning out of it. Hopefully, you're on the other side of your struggle so that you can, be honest and open about what you've been through and that you have that new perspective, that God would have you share. It could also, the literary could also have the weavings of biblical kind of narrative throughout there, like Paul's journeys or something like that. Maybe there are weavings of Psalms, maybe because, half the Psalms are laments. And almost, excuse me, almost half the Psalms are laments, half the Psalms are David's, but they're not all necessarily lament. So you could bring some of those in some way. You could talk about David's life and cause how he moved and he's running, Are you running for your life? Did you have to run through your life? There's a good, parallel story from the Bible that would be helpful in the telling of your story. So it could have more of a sort of poetic, sort of devotional style to it. But don't flip out and begin talking to the reader in the middle of your narrative. That's just not going to work. If you want to shift to that place where you are talking to the reader, offering help and suggestion, please do that at the end of your chapter and don't weave back and forth with this where you're telling a story and it's you're in the story itself and then shift off to teaching things. No, don't do that. Have a clear pattern from chapter to chapter about how you're going to structure this. How many little poetic elements do you want to weave in? How is that going to happen? So that there's a balance and there's this expectation. It takes a while for a reader to make friends with a book. And so when we have different ways of approaching different kind of chapters, it can harm that friendship that you're trying to develop with your reader. Set out a certain form for your chapters and kind of stick to that throughout. Okay, yeah, here just again some, these woven kind of chapters with the literary approach could be your story, biblical narrative, a parallel story. Maybe you don't just have one struggle. Maybe there are two or three. And so how would can you each chapter develop each of those in a little bit of way? Um, you know, when we had the most difficult kind of um, situation happen in our life, I was also going through a physical kind of struggle, surgery, post surgery kind of issues going on, that kind of thing. So, is there a health struggle along with a marriage struggle, along with raising kids struggle? So maybe you have three scenes in a chapter, three shorter scenes. So can you weave those or bring in observations in nature? I mean, like Lynn Hartkey, are you a holy hiker? So she weaves in her Arizona desert hiking experiences, which brilliantly tie to the struggles that she's going through. The things she sees helps her understand the perspective God wants her to have about her situation. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the idea of the prescriptive memoir, that it's a combo of the memoir and then Christian living, and it will satisfy kind of two reader desires, a story that draws, the reader in, but also some personal applications, some specifics that the reader can take away. But again, don't stick that in the middle of the narrative. Hold off for that to the end of each chapter. Maybe it's a sidebar, maybe it's something that actually occurs in a box or something like that. Definitely want to have some asterisks or something like that that signal to the reader, okay, the narrative has ended, and now here I'm going to offer some specific helps. What I wish I'd known, you know, what I know now, something like that, or God's word has shown me blah blah blah, and you do a little teaching point there. So this form is actually has a couple other titles to it. It's also called Memoir with Application or a Narrative Christian Living. It potentially could potentially could find it in two different places in a brick and mortar kind of bookstore. So, there's a little benefit to doing that approach. So how would we approach that? Okay, so you have a scene-based storytelling with the clear personal conflict and the struggle there, but then at some point, sorry for the mix-up on numbers here, um, moving these slides from Canva into PowerPoint and then into this form that we use for these videos changes what happens on the slides every once in a while. It's been frustrating. Sorry. So you have the scene-based storytelling, the conflict and the development of that. And then you're going to transition to this reflection chapter at the end of the chapter that's going to provide this teaching point addressed to the reader in regard to false assumptions, mistaken identity, whatever it is, whatever that struggle is the author had at that point. And then provide some biblically based teaching content about one key takeaway. Then you potentially could return to story, but you just really need to make sure that shift the reader is going to be able to make that shift in some sort of way. Do have some sort of physical signal in the text so that reader knows what to expect. You could also offer within that reflection, you could offer reflection questions, prayer for the reader, those things that you might typically find in a Christian Living book. And that number 3 down there, returning to your own story, I mostly mean that in terms of example as you're doing the teaching. So you bring a basic principle of what I learned was to read God's word every day, get a piece of that into my heart. Once I began doing that, then you can bring in that example there as opposed to actually fully returning to the narrative. This is an approach too. This approach of the mistaken identity versus a true identity. Think about who I was versus who God says I am. Then a journey story can help unfold the truth. What was it? What was the actual process? If you go back and you think about where were those major turning points in your life where that really helped develop you in your spiritual maturity. Go back and think of those, and then could those be fleshed out into scenes? So how have you gotten to the place where you are today? We don't need to know those scenes of brushing your teeth, okay? So only those kinds of narrative scenes that actually will build understanding for the reader. So think of those themes in your own life. And here's kind of a basic chapter formula for you. I'm a failure. I'm no good. God can't use me, etc. And then I feel unseen, and then, or maybe I'm too much. I'm not enough. And then, so there's these shifts of insecurities, the thought life that tends to hold us back. And then how did you come to this new understanding that you are God's and that He can, in fact, use you for ministry? As we're thinking about the memoir form, these will be some key elements that Christian publishers will expect, and therefore Christian readers will expect as well. So, a memoir is scene-based storytelling with internal struggle, internal conflict that's manifested through external conflict or situation, circumstances around me. There is carefully done description. Work on verbs as you're doing it, as opposed to adjectives. When I talk about description, I think about details in a room, details of what someone is wearing, instead of saying she was very beautiful. That's fake. I don't have a mental picture of that. Tell me all the details of that. And then think about how to develop a character, and not just you as the central character of your story, but maybe there's a parallel character, maybe your best friend, your sister, or someone like that. This person might be the person that you're bouncing ideas off of. You take your complaints to, she's the one that you call, or, your spouse, those kinds of situations. And maybe that character has a little arc as well, a developmental arc as well. And there doesn't necessarily have to be an evil villain in your story, but there could be someone central who is providing additional conflict or additional challenge to you. In fact, your mother could be like the villain of the story, but she's just being a mother. She just says those things that mothers do, right? So we want to see that clear character arc, and that's done through storytelling, it's done through scene creation, and that will build that spiritual transformation process. Um, we in Christian memoir, we do want to see some biblical integration. That doesn't mean we're slapping Bible verses here and there with all of the footnotes and all of that. You typically don't do that. It's not going to interrupt the story. Maybe someone says, maybe you as a character, or maybe you're reading the Bible and all of a sudden, that you see the words there, and you read them for really how they are intended for the first time. But then, again, it's important to keep physical movement occurring. So you can't, again, just have a character sort of sitting in her office chair all day long and having this spiritual transformation. We want to see that movement, and that there will actually be reader takeaway. It's more than just your story. It's going to be something that provides content for the reader who's reading your book. And so I did this little plot diagram with these fun little um, seasonal photos here. So the beginning of the story, it's fall, something's falling, something's happening, there's some kind of struggle that we learn about. And then there's these series of winter scenes, and you think about, our life cycles, can bring this about. We see this in nature, right? And winter, and then the real winter, and then winter hits again, all these scenes of winter throughout your book. I mean, there's this wrestling, with that. And then there's this spring moment, and the spring happens in the mind first, happens in the mind and the heart, and that's bringing about transformation. So then the falling scenes, then are scenes that show you in that better place. That doesn't mean you've got $3 million in the bank now. It just simply means that you've gone closer to God. You're in a better place in your personal journey. Um, so let's talk, kind of reasonable expectations about, okay, words and things like that, because I kind of, if you have seen my videos before, you know that I like to approach, writing contracts mathematically. So the chapters are balanced throughout, and that I actually can produce what's expected of not only the contract, but for the reader as well. So your traditional trade memoir, a book of this size, thickness, and so forth, is going to be between 60 and 75,000 words, which is, that's typical for novels. That's what the reader will expect you to produce. And a couple others that I have here are like Beth Moore's All My Knotted Up Life. You look at the thickness of it. It's a chunk of writing. If you produce 30,000 words, it's going to have a skinny spine. It's seemingly not going to be completely fleshed out or developed. If you're doing something that's more kind of devotional style, and if you ask me what that exactly is, I'm not sure that I can define that for you. But maybe they are just simply a collection of a series, just a series of stories. One I can think of would be from Maggie Rowe, Rowe, and so she has a book that is it's a collection. So each scene has its own arc. Each chapter has its own arc. New understanding every single scene, and I think it's a collection of 40 to 50 different short stories, essentially, about her life. So I would say that is more kind of a devotional style memoir. A caution with that is that a lot of people think, well, I have all these blogs online. What if I just, copy, paste, copy, paste them into, and hello, there's my memoir. It's thematically, it's probably not going to hang. It's probably not going to hang together unless your subject matter has consistently had the same sort of movement all the way through. So then, because otherwise it's just going to be too scattered. So yeah, caution with that. So you can approach that more devotionally, shorter chapters. Every scene has its own beginning, middle, end for every chapter in the book. So that could be a devotional style. A gift style memoir, shorter. One I pulled here that I think falls into that genre might be this. The Rock, the Road, and the Rabbi, and this is by Kathy Lee Gifford. And then a rabbi, like a Christian rabbi friend, they went to Israel, and it's essentially a series of reflections from the various historic sites in Israel. I don't think it's a really great book, actually, but it's an example of how, it could be more giftable in nature. And what I mean by that is I only picked this up because my husband and I were going to travel to Israel. And I thought, well, I should read that, 'cause maybe it'll give me some insight about the various places where we're going to go. And then as I read it, I only read about a third of it because I just didn't think the writing was all that great and wasn't that substantive. But you could have an approach like that. Perhaps it's, maybe it's a travel memoir of some kind. So it has that sort of very specific audience and perspective that you could offer. Before you begin thinking about writing your memoir, ask yourself these questions. I think this is really important. What is your central spiritual transformation that's going to occur through the book? You need to know that before you start writing, because that brings about purpose. That defines audience, because not everyone is going to read every book that's out there. Every book that's out there is not for everyone. So, what is that specific struggle that you had that is going to be manifested through the telling of your story? As you're thinking about that, again, it's not like, well, I was a victim, or I was abused, or no one cared about me growing up, or I experienced emotional abuse as a child. That's not your central problem. You have to identify your central character fault. It's a fault that you have going into that. And it could be false identity about who you are, as God's child. That could be it. But it's not the external situation that's going on. It's very important to know that before you begin writing, because then you're only going to choose those scenes that build that story, about that internal character fault. Okay. What false belief was eventually replaced with biblical truth? Okay, what did you believe? What did you begin to understand? How did that happen? Think about who your people are out there. Who are those people who are going to be going through a similar kinds of struggle? And then how would you think about, in terms of your life experience that you've gone through, what you've learned? What are those pieces they need? Okay. What felt needs will your memoir actually address, in other words? So that's it for today. Appreciate your coming in. See a few folks are here. Michael, hello. Kathy, and thanks for chiming in. Kathy writes, writing memoirs can not only help your readers, but helps the author learn, grow, and heal as well. Yes. The hopefully, continued healing happens, continued understanding happens as a result of writing your story. You may actually have another aha moment that's significant. But hopefully, we're writing that memoir at the end. We're at the end of that place where if the story is about bitterness and anger, we're on the other place of that. So got to make sure that that's happened. But again, yeah, and any kind of writing can help us grow spiritually. So thank you all for being here. And again, check out other videos that we have on the Book Marketing Pro Academy YouTube channel. And you can learn more about how to be a stronger writer by going to the website of Redemption Press and then checking out Book Marketing Pro Academy. Blessings.